Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. We are in the company of Christopher Dickey of The Daily Beast. We're also with David Chazan of The Daily Telegraph, Julie Owono of Internet Without Borders. Tell us what Internet Without Borders is.
It's an organization based in Paris, and we monitor new media in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America. And basically we try to see what are the most, how the citizens use the new media to have their voices being heard and being talked about by powerful ones.
So a bridge between reporters and citizen journalists.
Absolutely. That's what we're trying to do.
All right. We're also with somebody who knows a thing or two about new media, Lila Jacinto of France24.com. Earlier we talked about the word genocide. Now it's time for another semantic exercise. In Yemen, a Saudi-led coalition rebranding Operation Decisive Action as Operation Renewal of Hope. The end result, though, seems little different, with airstrikes there continuing, including in the port city of Aden, the target Iran-aligned Houthi militias and forces loyal to former President Saleh. Christopher Dickey, when you look at that map, we should also be pointed out that now you also have U.S. and French warships off the coast.
An Iranian warship.
Of Yemen, and Iranian ships as well. Could we sleepwalk into something with greater
Well, I think that's been the big
consequences?
concern since the beginning of the Saudi-led campaign, is that they went into this fight without very much consultation with the United States. They are carrying it out partly to prove that they, the Saudis, and their buddies in the Arab Gulf will stand up against what they see as Iranian encroachments. And how does that end? Where do you take that? They haven't defeated the Houthis. The Houthis are still in control of Sana'a. They're still fighting around Aden. And meanwhile, you have the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula making inroads in its territory, taking different towns. So it's a mess. It's a disaster. What happens when the Saudis have decided that they haven't been able to prove what they wanted to prove? Who picks up the pieces then? We don't know.
Why the change of name?
Well, because, as was suggested, there was no end game in sight. They did not have a strategy of when does this stop. Obviously, some pressure was put on from Washington, which is, eager to have a nuclear deal with Iran. And, it must be said, what is the genesis of the problem? Yemen has always been a difficult country. Someone has called governing Yemen, compared it to dancing on the heads of snakes. Saleh held it together because he played a very careful game of appeasement and, keeping all these tribes together. We made a deal where Saleh stayed in the country, and we had a very inept vice president take over. He's now in Riyadh. The game is to get Hadi back into
And Saleh
Sana'a.
is allied with the Houthis.
Exactly. And, Hadi is not capable. Let's admit it. He's not capable of holding this extremely difficult country to govern together. So what is our end game here? Saudi Arabia comes in and, Iran definitely makes use of the situation in order to build allegiance with the Houthis. There was not that much evidence earlier of certainly the Houthis would look to Iran as fellow Shiites. They don't follow the same branch of Shiism, but Iran has been using the situation, and we have absolutely created this this sectarian regional sectarian problem with no end goal in sight.
What do you think, Julie Owono, when you look at the bombing campaign taking place right now in Yemen, and you compare to the bombing campaign taking place against ISIS in places like Syria and Iraq?
Well, it's interesting that you asked us about what we do at Internet Without Borders, because we followed the beginning of this conflict by watching what the Yemenis were saying online. And first of all, it should be said that it was kind of a surprise. It was like, oh my God, the Saudis are bombing us, and where is that coming from? So the first fear, of course, is that the conflict will last, because, of course, we remember that in Syria it's been going on the bombings have been going on for years now, with possibly no direct issue in the near future. But what also is interesting about Yemen is that Yemen is at an interesting geographical point, because if you look at the map, it's not that far from Djibouti, which is also already in Africa. And
we've seen refugees go over to
course,
Djibouti and Somalia as well.
And Somalia as well. Two countries. Somali, we know Somali for the Shababs, who are already famous in the world for what they do in Kenya, for example. And Djibouti is also another very specific example. But yes, what's interesting here, it's really to see that it's not only an Arabic conflict. It probably will split over in other parts of the world, and it's interesting to see how it will unfold.
You know you're in trouble when refugees are fleeing to Somalia.
Well, I think a lot of them are going to Somaliland, aren't they?
Somaliland, yes.
which is relatively more
quasi-country.
peaceful,
I mean,
Right,
it's unrecognized.
but not
recognized
recognized.
by everyone. Yeah.
But I think there's a limit to what you can do from the air in a situation like that. It's a complex conflict. It's not really conventional warfare. And so what are you really going to achieve?
Well,
with
it
this
seemed
bombing?
when they changed the name that the idea was that this was the prelude to peace talks.
We haven't seen
That's interesting.
anything appearing, though, have we?
I was thinking when you said that about, the original name for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was Operation Iraqi Liberation, but when somebody pointed out that was OIL as an acronym, they decided it wasn't going to work.
Kind of gave the game away, some would say.
These names change. Remember Desert Storm, Desert Shield, all of that, as if that's going to make a huge difference. No, I think that the Saudis are not really ready to negotiate, because it would mean essentially that they had not accomplished very much.
But they're very good. But they're very good at spin.
Yes,
with the ambassador based in Washington giving the statement.
Yeah.
And the daily briefings that have been coming out of Riyadh.
Yeah, I wonder where they learned to do that.
But they're also looking at Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and they're looking to extend Shia influence, aren't they? The Iranians. Well, the Saudis
they're so much
watching the
better at it.
Iranians do this, and they're trying to hold it in check. And now in Yemen, it's the last straw. Yemen is not that, as you pointed out, it's just across the water from Somalia. It's not a million miles away from Saudi Arabia itself, is it?
Well, no, it borders Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
I mean, it's...
It's definitely become a smaller world, and case in point, nearly 1,800 deaths on the high seas, with people coming from as far away as places like Eritrea. Enough this week to finally prompt European leaders to meet to discuss how to save the lives of would-be migrants, and also how to stop them from coming, after the Italian Interior Minister warned there could be 5,000 new arrivals a week between now and September. EU leaders agreeing in Brussels Thursday to triple the funding for patrolling of the Mediterranean. There's also what leaders just into a vague pledge to take on smugglers, and non-binding calls for more European states to take on more of their share of asylum seekers.
Well, you're talking about tripling the budget. It's 120 million, which was what, this is the new Operation Triton. But it's the same budget as Italy's program, which was called Mare Nostrum, which was scrapped. So, all this talk about doing something came up with a 17-point program in Brussels, and really not that much. One of the proposals was talking about identifying traffickers' boats and destroying them. And no detail. How are we going to do this? How do you identify boats and in Libyan waters, boats parked in Libyan waters?
And most people have pointed out
Yeah,
that
talk about
boats
a
destroying
difficult air
boats,
campaign.
they're cheap, plentiful, and easy to replace. So you could destroy a few hundred boats. So what?
And so others will be built. And I think what's also striking with this crisis and how it has been managed by the EU and by African counterparts, also we have to talk about them, is that the Libyan case is really, I think, symptomatic of what's happening now. When Muammar Gaddafi was still in power in Libya, he was an ally in the fight against, illegal immigration for the EU. So it's also
Some
important
say
to remember.
he was effectively paid off to stop them from coming.
Well, yes. It has been said, and I think it might have been true. But it's interesting that we're talking about, symptoms, but not talking about, real where the problem comes from. I mean, talking about social problems in these countries, talking about wars, which have been fueled also by, foreign interests. It's also important to highlight this. And most of all, what's surprising and what's frustrating is that there has been no official reaction from African counterparts, nor from Eritrea, nor from I don't know what other countries concerned, and that's pretty much
Eritrea, the second most number of those would-be migrants after Syria these days.
They've got a lot to flee from. I mean, I've been up to Calais a few times, where you've got a couple of thousand migrants trying desperately to cross the channel into Britain, and they smuggle themselves in by climbing underneath lorries and so on. And every day, I'm sure a few of them do get through. Some get killed. They're prepared to risk their lives. And I mean, you and I, Francois, we've worked in Africa too. I've been to Eritrea. I was there when it became independent. I met the Eritrean leader when he was still a freedom fighter in those tunnels, waging a prolonged war against the terrible Ethiopian dictator Mengistu. And the problem is that Isaias Afwerki, who is still the Eritrean leader, has not really changed his philosophy or the way he deals with people since the end of the guerrilla struggle. So he is prepared to conscript people into the army for an indefinite period. So if you're a young Eritrean man and you think you're going to be conscripted, you know that you've got precious little chance of ever coming back, at least not alive. So you are prepared to risk everything to get out. So it's a very difficult situation, because on the other hand, in Europe, we've got to protect our own societies. And as David Cameron pointed out the other day, we don't know who these people are. It's all very well to say, well, we should throw the borders open, they're fleeing terrible dictatorships, repression, economic hardship, but we don't know who they are. And it strikes me that these two things we've been talking about today, terrorism and migration, are the two big issues of our time, and they feed into each other, and they're interrelated in so many different ways.
The network that was arrested in Italy were involved with people trafficking, people smuggling. That was one of their enterprises. It wasn't just plotting to attack the Vatican. So they absolutely do.
All right, David was mentioning the British Prime Minister, and in the UK, this has been a big talking point this week. While some were lambasting Europe for its underwhelming response to the crisis, we can show you this Friday's front page of the Daily Mail directing its ammo at the leader of the UK's opposition. Less than 2 weeks ahead of Election Day, migrants inviting themselves into the campaign, migrants and their port of departure. Dateline, Benghazi, Libya, September 15th, 2011. At the time, David Cameron was there with Nicolas Sarkozy to celebrate victory in the campaign to chase Muammar Gaddafi from power. Labour leader Ed Miliband remembers.
David Cameron was wrong to assume that Libya was a country whose institutions could simply be left to evolve and transform themselves. What we've seen in Libya is that when tensions over power and resource began to emerge, they simply reinforced deep-seated ideological and ethnic fault lines in the country, meaning the hopes of the revolutionary uprisings quickly began to unravel. The tragedy is this could have been anticipated and it should have been avoided.
Cameron, who, by the way, his Conservatives hold a slender lead in the polls, later in the day in Lincoln, he responded in kind.
But the people responsible for the tragedy in the Mediterranean are the criminal gangs and the traffickers who are plying this evil trade. And that is why I went to Brussels yesterday and offered the flagship of the Royal Navy, cutters, extra boats to help, all the intelligence and security information that we have, working with our partners to put an end to this evil trade. That is what we should do.
All right, so on the one hand, David, there's Ed Miliband saying this is Britain didn't have a game plan in Libya, and David Cameron saying, no, it's about targeting the smugglers.
Well, obviously Cameron has to acknowledge that Libya's fallen apart since the international operation, and the prime mover in getting Western airstrikes carried out against Colonel Gaddafi, in order to stop him massacring huge numbers of his own people, was Nicolas Sarkozy of France. And Cameron went along with it and joined in. And initially it looked like a huge success, a little bit like Iraq did, I suppose, after the Americans went in. And then it quickly descended into sort of anarchy with different clans fighting each other. And what you've got now is a situation where you've got both Al-Qaeda and IS moving into Libya. Very, very dangerous indeed. But I don't know how much traction Miliband is going to get with this in Britain, because nobody has forgotten that his predecessor as Labour leader, Tony Blair, was the man who ordered British troops into Iraq in an operation and a war that was extremely unpopular in Britain, where you had unprecedented numbers of British people marching through the streets, up to 1 million people joining a march through London, and it still went ahead.
Julie, you want to correct me if I'm wrong? Nicolas Sarkozy is now the head of the opposition here in France. He hasn't been called to task much on this.
No, I mean, I think it's a bit. He wants to hide this sort of failure. I think Libya.
Well, he has today by Bernard Kouchner, the founder of MSF, Doctors Without Borders.
Who was his foreign minister.
Yeah, and also by Stéphane Le Foll, who is the current socialist agriculture minister in France. And they've said much the same thing that Miliband said to Cameron.
Yes, and that's what makes think today that basically what happened in Libya was not prepared. I think we can all agree on this, at least on what should come after, because as you were saying, there were plans.
So Christopher Dickey, what do Britain and France do?
Now?
You solid.
Well, they're going to have to pay me for that.
No, they'll give you the Nobel Peace Prize if you get it right.
I mean, look, I don't think that there is an easy solution, but I do think in the medium term, we have to have a lot more expertise dealing with any of these countries and any of these situations. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we ought to reopen the colonial office, but the truth is, when you look at a place like Libya, sure, there are people on the ground who have a general understanding of what a mess it's going to be, but nobody listens to them. It was exactly the same in Iraq in 2003. We're going to go in, we're going to take the top off of a boiling cauldron, and then it's going to start to overflow, and we're going to walk away and say, as Donald Rumsfeld said, stuff happens.
Stuff happens.
All right.
Yeah.
David Chazan questioning Ed Miliband's credentials when it comes to criticizing over Libya. He is striking a chord, however, the 45-year-old Labour leader, not so much over policy, but, wait for it, over his looks. For more, it's our Media Watch segment. We are joined by Emma James. Emma, welcome.
Hi.
What is this? What is it? This hashtag again?
Millifandom. It was actually the #1 top trending hashtag in the United Kingdom. This was on Tuesday evening. This is when this all kind of kicked off. And it's really started something of a media storm. Lots of people jumping on the bandwagon.
Hang on, so the British suddenly discovered that he was good looking?
Improbable as it may seem, yes. Now, if we take a look at, there's one video which I think really gives us an idea of what it is that we're being bombarded with if you're looking at anything to do with the UK election. This is him striking a sultry pose. It's the same image on a permanent loop, and you can hear George Michael crooning in the background.
Leela Jacinta, why are you laughing?
Because I'm a David Miliband fan. They got the wrong brother.
I think a lot of people in the UK would agree with you. We got the wrong Miliband. Case of mistaken identity.
And not just when it comes to Millifandom, but I think a lot of people think he should have been the Labour leader too. But what this started with was a 17-year-old girl called Abby. She's been a little bit surprised and has admitted that maybe it wasn't too serious to begin with, but it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And if we take a look at this article from BuzzFeed, which is where all the young people tend to get their information rather than the sort of traditional media sites. And she's now got, I think it's over 17,000 followers courtesy of Millifandom. She says there are those in the Millifandom who find it funny, those who wonder how the hell Ed Miliband has a fandom. If you're wondering what a fandom is, I'm guessing that might be your next question. It's where teenage girls become so enamoured with normally it's a movie star, and they have their own fandom, kind of like a kingdom. That's the idea behind all this. It's all rather surreal because, as you see, there are images like this now being posted. Ed Miliband flower crown edits. Why he's wearing a flower crown, I don't know. None of this makes a great deal of sense. It has to be said. You've got other tweets coming up. I love Ed Miliband so much, it's painful. If I ever met Ed Miliband, I could die happy. He's cool. Now, this isn't what anyone really would be expecting. It's something of a Labour dream, you might say, to be able to attract the youth vote.
Or a plant, maybe.
Well, you do wonder. And apparently, in the Telegraph today, they've spoken to Abby, 17 years old. She claims to have actually turned her parents, who are Tory voters, hated Ed Miliband, but in the course of this week, since she started talking about Miliband, apparently she says they will now vote Labour.
Okay, remind us of the Ed Miliband before Tuesday.
Before Tuesday, this is the kind of coverage you can expect. Ed Miliband alongside an image of Wallace from Wallace and Gromit, the Aardman animation movies. And this article is actually talking about the Shaun the Sheep movie, another effort from them. And they're saying, actually, this character in the Shaun the Sheep movie must have been based on Ed Miliband, and it is hard to argue. I think possibly they might be right there. So that's how we're used to seeing him. It is, and this is another perfect example. A year ago, almost to the day, he was berated for not being able to eat a bacon sandwich in an appropriate manner. Apparently, they felt that it showed he was out of touch with the people. He couldn't eat a sort of a working man's breakfast. So he was lambasted for that. And these very unfortunate photographs went everywhere. But now there's been a real turn in the tide. And I wonder if it's this. LBC, which is a London radio station, tweeted this image of Ed Miliband getting off his campaign bus and bumping into a hen party, who then got very excited, took lots of selfies with the Labour leader.
Oh, dear.
Now, that was only earlier this month, so I do wonder if maybe that's had an impact. And this is the kind of thing that we're seeing now. Moody, supposedly sexy shots of the Labour leader. Lots of sort of joke images too. That's supposed to be Ed Miliband posing as Prince, of course, the artist formerly known as. That one a little racy, perhaps. But there are thousands of these, and this one says, you know, he used to look like Harry Potter, maybe trying to show how the young people are going for that kind of look too.
And I understand there was an effort by the Conservatives to fight back.
Yes, there was. Cameronettes started to, well, not really trend, but appear on Twitter. This image really says it all.
Hold on, say that again.
The Cameronettes.
Cameronettes?
Yes. Now, these are the kind of things that people were tweeting about, the fact that he's hired a PR guru, £500,000 a year to run an election campaign, and he's now being beaten by a 17-year-old girl with a Twitter account. But if we take a look at this, we have another article from the Telegraph. The Cameronettes, they've spoken to the person who started it, and there is a ubiquitous photograph of Cameron with One Direction, supposedly the teen heartthrobs of the moment. And they have spoken to this person, but as others have pointed out, the actual Twitter account, which is the Cameronettes, @Cameronettes, only has 182 followers. So they've got some way to go before they can catch up with 17-year-old Abby.
Like Boris Johnson up there.
Yes.
There are
Pretender.
some fabulous articles, and it is interesting. It really shows you how the internet is something of a cruel mistress, because there were articles on BuzzFeed, Mashable, just 3 days before they then started talking about he's a sex symbol. They were berating him for not understanding what YOLO means. I confess I had to look it up. You only live once. He didn't know. He gave his answers in an interview and then decided that he thought that was quite cool and might adopt it. But it just goes to show how the tides change, because 3 days later, they're talking about swarms of teens obsessing over him.
Juliana, what does it say about the general election campaign in Britain this year?
Well, it questions whether teens will have influence on the votes of their older brothers and sisters and parents. So if they do, that would be interesting to witness.
Exactly, because Abby that we're talking about is only 17 years old, so she's not eligible to vote. Whether any of this is likely to really swing anyone's opinion is somewhat doubtful, because I think Ed Miliband, as much as he might get some kudos for attracting attention from teenagers, I think also he's in for quite a bit of mockery there with these images.
Christopher Dickey, it's been described as a fragmented election campaign. We know that whoever wins is going to possibly have the smallest majority ever. Is this a further sign that the actual campaign manifestos are boring stuff compared to all this?
And the two main candidates, Miliband and Cameron, are just boring as hell. and so, in fact, anything that livens it up is good for the candidate if he's associated with it. I don't think that teenagers are going to come out, even if they could, I don't think they're going to come out en masse and vote for Miliband. But even the older generation is going to look at that and say, oh, that's a fun side of this incredibly boring guy that I never saw before. And that's exactly where the irony of the Cameronettes, because nothing like that is happening on his side.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you've got the more sinister figures like the UKIP leader and the whole weird, fractured, as you say, world of British politics right now. It will be an interesting election night to watch.
Completely unpredictable.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what the outcome will be, and that's really the first time I can remember. We've always known in the past, pretty much, who was going to win. This time, we don't have a clue. All we know is that we'll have a hung parliament. It'll be the second time the UK has a coalition, so, we kind of become European,
right, so
against our own wishes.
It's all up in the air whether it'll be Millie Phantom or the Cameronettes that win on May the 7th. I want to thank our panel once again, David Chazan, Lila Jacinto. I also want to thank Christopher Dickey, Julia Wono, Emma James for being with us for Media Watch. Thank you for joining us here for The World This Week.